The stagecoach rattled to a halt in the dust-choked main street of Eldridge, Montana, under a sky heavy with the promise of early winter snow. It was November 1887, and the wind carried the sharp bite of pine and frozen earth, whipping at the hems of skirts and the brims of hats like an unwelcome hand. Eleanor Hayes stepped down from the coach, her boots sinking slightly into the rutted mud that had frozen overnight and thawed just enough to cling. She clutched a worn carpet bag in one gloved hand, the other smoothing the faded wool of her traveling dress, a garment that had once been deep blue but now bore the gray pallor of too many miles and too little hope. She had come here on a whisper of possibility, a letter from a distant cousin promising work and a fresh start. "The West heals what the East breaks," the note had said, scrawled in hasty ink. Eleanor had sold her late husband's pocket watch to afford the journey, leaving behind the shadowed alleys of Boston where whispers followed her like ghosts. Widow, barren, whipped not with leather, but with words 100 lashes from tongues that judged her empty womb as a curse, her grief as weakness. Her marriage to Thomas had been a cage of quiet despair, his frustration turning to blame until his fever took him, leaving her alone with the echoes of failure. Eldridge unfolded before her like a faded daguerreotype, wooden storefronts leaning against the wind, a saloon spilling laughter and smoke, horses tethered to posts with frost-rimmed manes. She scanned the faces of the few townsfolk braving the chill, a shopkeeper sweeping his porch, a cluster of women in calico dresses huddled near the mercantile, their eyes narrowing as they took her in. Stranger, outsider, her cousin, Martha, was supposed to meet her here, but the street held no familiar face, only the indifferent gaze of strangers. She approached the post office, a squat building with a sign creaking in the breeze. The clerk, a weary man with spectacles perched on his nose, glanced up from his ledger. "Help you, ma'am, I'm Eleanor Hayes, here to see Martha Wilkins. She wrote me." His expression shifted, a flicker of pity mixed with something colder. "Martha? She passed last week. Consumption. Didn't leave much behind, except debts and an empty cabin up the hill." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through her chest. No welcome, no kin, just the hollow echo of another door slamming shut. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight, refusing to let the tremor in her hands show. "I see, thank you." Outside, the wind howled louder, carrying flecks of snow that stung her cheeks. The women by the mercantile whispered now, their voices slicing through the air. "Another drifter, probably running from something. Ain't fit for decent folk." She straightened her spine, the carpet bag heavier now, and turned toward the livery stable, seeking shelter for the night. The town stretched vast and unforgiving, mountains looming like silent judges in the distance. Hope, that fragile thread, frayed a little more, but she walked on, each step a quiet defiance against the cold that seeped not just into her bones, but her soul. The West, it seemed, was no kinder than the East, only broader in its indifference. Eleanor trudged up the frost-crusted path to Martha's cabin, the directions given by the stable hand as grudging as the dusk settling over Eldridge. The air smelled of damp pine and coal smoke, and the weight of her carpet bag pulled at her shoulder, its frayed handle biting into her palm. The cabin sat at the edge of town, a squat structure of weathered logs half swallowed by shadows and neglect. Its single window was dark, the door sagging on rusted hinges. She pushed it open, the creak echoing like a warning in the stillness. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and abandoned dreams. A rickety table held a chipped teacup, a remnant of Martha's life, and a thin layer of dust coated the floorboards. The fireplace was cold, its hearth empty save for a scattering of ash. Eleanor set her bag down, her breath visible in the chill, and knelt to coax a fire from the few sticks of kindling left in a corner. The flames caught slowly, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts of the life she'd hoped to find. She sat on the edge of a straw mattress, the ticking worn thin, and unwrapped a shawl from her bag, her mother's, soft wool dyed indigo, now faded to a whisper of its former self. It was her only keepsake, a shield against the loneliness that pressed in like the cold seeping through the cabin's cracks. The town's rejection stung, those whispered judgments by the mercantile cutting deeper than Boston's had, perhaps because she'd dared to hope for better. Barren, broken, the words clung to her, as if her body's refusal to bear life marked her as less than whole. Outside, the wind moaned, rattling the window pane. She thought of Thomas, his bitter sighs when each month passed without a child, his voice sharp as he'd called her a failure before his fever claimed him. She'd loved him once, or tried to, but love had withered under the weight of blame. Now, alone in this foreign place, she felt the ache of that old wound, raw and unhealed. Yet she rose, her hands steady as she swept the floor with a brittle broom, claiming the space as hers, if only for tonight. Survival demanded it. She would not beg nor break. The fire crackled, a small defiance against the dark, and she wrapped the shawl tighter, whispering to herself, "Tomorrow, I begin again." Dawn broke over Eldridge like a reluctant promise, the sun filtering through a veil of low clouds, casting a pale light on the snow-dusted rooftops. Eleanor rose with the first crow of a distant rooster, her breath fogging the cabin's single window as she boiled water on the iron stove she'd scavenged wood for the night before. The air inside carried the faint, acrid scent of smoke from her meager fire, mingling with the earthy dampness of the logs. She smoothed her dress, practical cotton now, mended at the cuffs and pinned her hair into a simple knot, steeling herself against the chill that lingered in her bones. The town awoke slowly, wagons creaking along the main street, their wheels carving fresh ruts in the thawing mud. Eleanor stepped out, her boots crunching on the frosted ground, carpetbag replaced by a basket holding the few tools she'd brought: needles, thread, a pair of shears, and scraps of fabric from her old life. She would not idle. Idleness invited pity, and pity was a chain she refused to wear. Her first stop was the Mercantile, where the same cluster of women from yesterday eyed her approach, their conversations halting like a drawn breath. "Mornin'," she said to the proprietor, a stout man named Harlan with a mustache like broom bristles. "I'm handy with a needle. Mending? Sewing, whatever needs doing. Fair price." He appraised her, his gaze lingering on her worn shawl. "We got our own seamstress, ma'am. But folks always need extras. Try the boarding house or the saloon, curtains tear easy there." She nodded, no plea in her voice, and moved on. By midday, she'd secured scraps of work, hemming trousers for a miner with calloused hands, patching a quilt for the widow Jenkins who lived on the outskirts. The pay was meager, a few coins, a loaf of bread, but it was hers, earned by the prick of needle through fabric, the rhythmic pull of thread that echoed her resolve. In the quiet of the cabin that evening, she worked by lamplight, the flame flickering over the cloth like a companion's gaze. Each stitch was a reclamation, binding the frayed edges of her spirit. The townsfolk whispered as she passed that eastern widow, alone and childless, "What good is she?" Their words like winter wind slipping under doors. At the bakery, where she traded mending for flour, the owner clucked her tongue. "A woman needs can out here, or she'll wither." Eleanor met her eyes steadily, her fingers never pausing on the dough she kneaded later, the scent of yeast rising like quiet defiance. She baked simple loaves, their crusts golden and firm, and sold them door to door, ignoring the doors that slammed or the pitying shakes of heads. Isolation wrapped around her like the deepening snow, blanketing the world in white silence. Yet in that hush, she found a fragile strength, planting seeds of self in the frozen soil. No man to define her, no society to cage her. She built her days layer by layer, like the quilts she pieced from remnants. The ache of her past lingered, a shadow in her chest, but she breathed through it, her hands creating where her womb could not. Spring would come, she told herself, as the weeks blurred into a rhythm of quiet endurance as winter tightened its grip on Eldridge, the snow falling in relentless sheets that muffled the world like a heavy quilt. Eleanor's days were stitched together with needle and thread, her fingers raw from the cold that seeped through the cabin walls, but steady in their purpose. She'd taken to delivering mended garments along the main street, her boots leaving faint tracks in the fresh powder, the basket over her arm heavy with folded linens and the faint scent of lavender she pressed into the fabrics, a small luxury from dried blooms she'd carried from Boston. At the general store, where shelves groaned under tins of beans and bolts of calico, she often traded her work for necessities: flour, salt, a spool of thread. The proprietor, Harlan, had grown accustomed to her presence, his gruff nods a silent acceptance, though the whispers from other patrons lingered like smoke. On this particular afternoon, the bell above the door tinkled as she entered, shaking snow from her shawl. The air inside was warmer, laced with the aroma of coffee beans and leather, a respite from the biting wind outside. She placed a neatly folded shirt on the counter mended for the blacksmith, its collar reinforced with precise stitches. As Harlan tallied her credit, a man entered behind her, his broad frame filling the doorway. Samuel Thorne was a fixture in Eldridge, a widower rancher with a spread 5 miles out, raising 3 young ones since his wife's passing 2 years prior from childbirth fever. His face was weathered by sun and sorrow, lines etched around eyes the color of storm clouds, his hands callous from rains and plows. He carried a list scrawled in a child's uneven hand: sugar, yarn, perhaps a tin of molasses for his daughter's sweet tooth. Eleanor felt his gaze before she saw it, not the prying stare of the townsfolk, but something gentler, like sunlight, filtering through frost on a windowpane. She turned slightly, meeting his eyes as he removed his hat, snowflakes melting in his dark hair. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice low and even, like the rumble of distant thunder. No questions about her origins, no flicker of judgment, only a nod that acknowledged her as she was, basket in hand, standing tall amid the shelves. "Afternoon," she replied, her tone measured, folding her hands to hide the tremor of unexpected warmth. He stepped to the counter, placing his items beside hers, and she noticed the yarn he selected: soft wool in a muted green, the kind for knitting small mittens. Harlan chuckled. "Thorne, your little ones keep you runnin'. This here's Mrs. Hayes, new in town, fine with a needle." Samuel glanced at the mended shirt, his fingers brushing the fabric lightly. "Good work," he said simply, his eyes lifting to hers. Again, not pity, not curiosity laced with suspicion, but respect for the craft, for the quiet labor that mirrored his own days of mending fences and hearts. In that moment, amid the creak of floorboards and the scent of spices, an unspoken thread pulled taut between them, a recognition of shared solitude, of building from broken pieces. She gathered her supplies and left, the bell chiming her exit. But the weight of his gaze followed her into the snow, a subtle shift in the cold air. For the first time since arriving, the isolation felt a fraction less absolute, like the first crack in winter's ice. As winter deepened, Eldridge hunkered under a blanket of unrelenting snow, the days shortening like breaths held too long. Eleanor's routine had woven itself into the fabric of the town: mornings spent sewing by the cabin's hearth, afternoons delivering bundles along streets where icicles hung like fragile daggers from eaves. The cold had a way of stripping illusions, leaving only the bare truth of survival, and in that starkness, her encounters with Samuel Thorne became threads of quiet warmth in an otherwise frozen tapestry. He appeared at the general store with regularity, his visits timed to the needs of his ranch and children: a sack of flour for bread, nails for mending barns, a length of ribbon for his youngest's hair. Eleanor found herself there often, trading her sewn goods for staples, and their paths crossed not by chance, but by the subtle pull of habit. One gray afternoon, as she arranged a stack of patched linens on the counter, he entered, stamping snow from his boots, the scent of hay and wood smoke clinging to his coat like a memory. She nodded in greeting, her hands folding a quilt square she'd pieced from scraps, blues and grays evoking the winter sky. Samuel paused by the shelves, selecting a jar of preserves, his fingers lingering on the glass as if weighing more than its contents. "Cold one today," he said, his voice carrying the steady rhythm of a man accustomed to speaking to the land. "More than people, it is," she replied, her eyes on her work, though she felt the weight of his presence like sunlight-piercing clouds. He never asked about Boston, or the husband whose absence marked her as a widow in the townsfolk's eyes. Instead, he spoke of the present, the way the river had frozen solid, or how his cattle huddled against the wind. In turn, she offered fragments of her days: the satisfaction of a well-hemmed seam, the warmth of bread fresh from her oven. Over weeks, these exchanges deepened without words to name them. He'd hold the door for her as she left, his hand brushing hers in the transfer of a package, a touch that lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary, sending a spark through the chill. Once, spotting her struggling with a heavy basket in the drifts outside, he wordlessly took it from her arm, carrying it to her cabin's path before tipping his hat and turning back. No fanfare, no expectation of thanks, just the quiet act of seeing her burden and easing it. In the evenings, by her fire's glow, Eleanor traced the symbolism in these moments, his gestures like stitches binding unseen wounds, mending the frayed edges of her isolation. She caught herself thinking of him, his quiet strength, the way his eyes softened when mentioning his children, 3 souls navigating loss as she did. Her resilience grew in these silences, a garden budding under snow, nourished by the unspoken respect that bloomed between them. He saw her nod as Brokeith Thaw came hesitantly to Eldridge as February yielded to March, the snow retreating in patches to reveal mud-slicked earth and the first stubborn shoots of green pushing through the frost. The air softened, carrying the faint, earthy promise of spring, though nights still clung to winter's chill. Eleanor's cabin had become a sanctuary of sorts, its walls echoing with the hum of her sewing machine, a treadle model she'd bartered for with weeks of mending and the scent of baking that warded off the lingering cold. Her resilience had rooted deeper in these months, like those emerging sprouts, drawing strength from the quiet rhythm of her days and the unspoken tether to Samuel. She'd seen him more frequently now, their encounters at the general store evolving into brief, meaningful pauses amid the bustle. He'd share a word about his eldest boy's progress with reading, or how his daughter had taken to weaving simple braids, his voice laced with a father's tender pride that mirrored the care she poured into her crafts. In return, she'd mention the quilts she pieced, symbols of warmth stitched from fragments, much like the life she was rebuilding. But words were mere outlines. It was the silences between them that held the true depth, pregnant with understanding. One crisp morning, as sunlight slanted through her window like golden thread, Eleanor decided on the gesture, her hands steady. From endless stitching, kneaded dough for a tart apple, from the last of the preserved fruit she'd traded for, spiced with cinnamon that filled the cabin with a warm, inviting aroma. It was more than sustenance. It was a piece of her heart, baked golden and flaky, a risk wrapped in pastry. The rosemary sprig she'd tucked into the loaf weeks prior had been her first tentative offering, left anonymously at the store, but this was deliberate, personal. She crimped the edges with care, each fold a whisper of vulnerability, acknowledging the affection that had bloomed quietly within her. She wrapped the tart in clean linen, its warmth seeping through the fabric as she walked to the store, her boots sinking into the softening ground. The bell chimed her entry, and there he was, Samuel, examining a bolt of cloth for his children's Easter clothes. Their eyes met, and she approached, basket in hand, her pulse a soft drumbeat against the quiet. "For you," she said simply, placing the bundle on the counter beside him. No explanation, no flourish, just the offering, steam rising faintly like a sigh. It was her emotional leap, a handmade token that spoke of gratitude for his unspoken kindnesses, for seeing her as more than her wounds. He unfolded the linen slowly, his callous fingers gentle, revealing the tart's perfect crust. A moment stretched, silent and profound, as the scent mingled with the store's spices. His eyes lifted to hers, storm cloud gray softening to the hue of a dawning sky, a warmth there that needed no words. He nodded, a small smile curving his lips, not broad, but deep, like roots anchoring soil. "Thank you, Eleanor," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of recognition, of acceptance. She turned to leave, the risk taken, her heart lighter yet fuller, the gesture bridging the space between them. In that silence, affection deepened, a symbol of healing woven into the fabric of their shared world, promising more as spring whispered of renewal. Eleanor barren, but as whole in her perseverance, her hands creating beauty from remnants. One evening, as flurries danced outside her window, she baked an extra loaf, wrapping it in cloth with a sprig of dried rosemary tucked in, a symbol of remembrance, of quiet affection stirring. Tomorrow, she'd leave it at the store for him, no note, just the gesture speaking what words dared not yet voice. The connection threaded stronger, invisible yet unbreakable, thawing the winter within her heart. Spring unfurled over Eldridge, like a quilt shaken out after a long winter, the hills blooming with wild lupine, and the air sweet with the scent of warming earth. It was early April, and the town square buzzed with preparations for the annual spring fair, a patchwork of stalls draped in calico and bunting, the laughter of children mingling with the clatter of wagon wheels. Eleanor had woven herself into the rhythm of the town, her mending and baking now sought after, though whispers of her past still trailed her like dust on a breeze. She wore her resilience quietly, her indigo shawl, a shield against the sidelong glances of those who still saw her as the barren widow from the east. She arrived at the fair with a basket of goods to quilts, their patches stitched with care, and a batch of tarts, their golden crusts fragrant with apple and clove. Her stall, a simple plank table, stood near the church steps, where the community gathered under a sky streaked with clouds like spun cotton. She arranged her wares with steady hands, her dress plain but neat, her hair pinned loosely, strands catching the sunlight. The townsfolk passed by, some pausing to barter, others offering curt nods, their judgments softened by the quality of her work but not erased. Samuel appeared mid-morning, his 3 children trailing him like ducklings. Leela, 8, with braids tied in the green ribbon he'd bought, Ben, 10, clutching a whittled toy horse, and little Ruth, 5, her eyes wide as she tugged at his sleeve. He carried a crate of early vegetables from his ranch, carrots and turnips dusted with earth, their roots, a testament to his labor. Eleanor's breath caught as he approached her stall, his presence steady as the mountains framing the horizon. The crowd noticed, heads turning, whispers stirring like leaves in the wind. The widower and the widow bold of her, bold of him. Morning, Eleanor, he said, setting his crate down nearby. His voice was low, unhurried, cutting through the chatter. He didn't flinch at the stares, his gaze resting on her with the same quiet respect he'd shown in the store, as if the town's opinions were no more than distant thunder. Morning, Samuel, she replied, her fingers brushing the edge of a quilt, its pattern, a mosaic of blues and grays, like the river they both knew. Leela darted forward, touching the tart's linen wrap with a shy smile. Smells like home, the girl said, and Eleanor's heart warmed, a crack in the armor she'd worn so long. Samuel bought a tart, his coin pressed into her palm with a gentleness that lingered, and he lingered too, helping her rearrange the quilts when a gust threatened to topple them. They worked side by side, their movements a silent dance, shoulders brushing once, twice, each touch a spark in the spring air. The townsfolk watched, some with raised brows, others with softening eyes, as if seeing her anew not as a broken thing, but as a woman whose hands created beauty, whose presence steadied a man like Samuel. She held her head high, her dignity a quiet fire, and he stood with her, unyielding against the whispers. The fair carried on, but in that shared space, they carved a moment of transformation not loud, but profound, like spring's first bloom breaking through frost. Their connection, once a private thread, now gleamed in the open, fragile yet defiant, a promise taking root in the town's reluctant soil. The April evening settled over Eldridge with a hush, the sky deepening to indigo, pricked with stars like needlepoints of light. The fair had wound down, leaving the square littered with trampled grass and the fading hum of laughter. Eleanor lingered at her stall, packing the last quilt into her basket, its fabric soft against her fingers, the scent of apple tarts still clinging to the
air. The town felt quieter now, the weight of the day's scrutiny lifting, replaced by the gentle rustle of wind through budding aspens. Samuel approached as she tied her shawl, his silhouette broad against the firelight from a bonfire burning near the church. His children had been sent home with a neighbor, and he carried only a lantern, its glow casting soft shadows across his face, lines carved by loss, softened by hope. "Mind if I walk you back?" he asked, his voice steady but threaded with something new, a vulnerability like the first crack of ice on a river. She nodded, her throat tight, and they set out toward her cabin, the path winding past fields where new grass shimmered under starlight. The air was cool, scented with earth and pine, and their footsteps fell in rhythm, a quiet cadence against the night's silence. Neither spoke at first, the space between them filled with the unspoken, the tart she'd baked, the quilts he'd steadied, the glances that had woven their lives closer over weeks. Her heart beat a fragile rhythm, fear and longing braided together. For to open herself to this was to risk the pain she'd carried from Thomas's blame. They paused by a low fence near her cabin, the lantern's light pooling around them. Samuel set it down, his hands flexing as if searching for words. "Eleanor," he began, his eyes meeting hers, gray and clear as dawn. "I see you. Not what they say, not what you've lost. I see the way you keep on, stitching things whole, making beauty from what's left. You've done that for my kids. Lila talks of your tarts like they're magic, and you've done it for me." Her breath caught, the words sinking deep, mending cracks she'd thought permanent. "Samuel, I've been called broken. Not enough. I don't know if I can be more than I am." Her voice trembled, raw with the truth she'd never spoken aloud in Eldridge. He stepped closer, not touching, but near enough that she felt his warmth through the chill. "You're enough, Eleanor. More than. You remind me there's life after grief, that a man can feel whole again. I want you in my days, not to fix me, but to share them." The confession hung between them, tender as new leaves, and she felt tears prick, not from sorrow, but from the release of being seen. She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing his calloused palm, and he drew her gently closer. Their kiss was soft, deliberate, a seal on the intimacy built in silences and gestures. Under the stars, by the lantern's glow, they stood, two souls mending each other, their hearts blooming like spring after a long winter. The days after their confession unfolded like the slow unfurling of spring, each moment vibrant with possibility, yet grounded in the quiet strength of shared purpose. May draped Eldridge in warmth, the hills alive with wildflowers, purple aster and goldenrod swaying in breezes that carried the scent of sun-warmed grass. Eleanor's cabin, once a refuge of solitude, now hummed with life, its walls absorbing the soft laughter of Samuel's children and the steady rhythm of plans taking root. Samuel came often, his wagon rattling up the path with Lila, Ben, and Ruth spilling out, their small hands eager to help. Together, they built a new future in small deliberate acts. One morning, they planted a garden behind the cabin, Samuel turning the soil with a spade, while Eleanor knelt beside him, pressing seeds into the earth. Carrots, beans, and a row of marigolds for beauty, their golden petals a symbol of hope. The children scattered dirt, Ruth giggling as she dropped seeds too close together, and Eleanor's heart swelled at their chaos, a fullness she'd never thought to feel. "Careful now, Ruthie," Samuel said, his voice warm as he brushed soil from her cheek. He glanced at Eleanor, his eyes holding hers, a silent acknowledgement that this, dirt under nails, shared labor, children's laughter, was their beginning. She smiled, her fingers lingering in the earth, the act of planting echoing the life she was building, not from what was lost, but from what was found. They worked on the cabin too, Samuel hammering new boards to shore up the sagging porch. Eleanor, stitching curtains from calico remnants, their edges precise as her heart's cautious opening. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of peach and lavender, he took her hand by the garden's edge. "Eleanor," he said, his voice steady as the mountains. "I want this life with you. Marry me. Not for the town, not for the kids alone, but for us." Her breath hitched, the weight of his words settling like a quilt over her shoulders. She thought of Boston, of Thomas's cold silences, and how Samuel's presence warmed the hollows of her past. "Yes," she whispered, her voice a vow, her hand tightening in his. It was no grand gesture, but a commitment born of mutual respect, of seeing each other's scars and choosing to build anyway. They planned quietly, a simple wedding at the church, a shared home on his ranch where her quilts would drape their beds, where her tarts would fill the kitchen with sweetness. The garden grew, shoots breaking through soil, and with each day, Eleanor felt her roots deepen, entwined with his, their future a tapestry woven from trust and time. The town's whispers faded, irrelevant against the certainty of their bond, a life planted together in the fertile ground of spring. June's warmth had settled over Eldridge, the Montana sky stretching wide and blue, a canvas of hope above the rolling hills now lush with green. The small church at the edge of town stood adorned with wildflowers, daisies and lupine woven into garlands by Lila and Ruth, their hands sticky with sap and pride. Eleanor stood at the threshold, her dress a simple ivory muslin she'd sewn, herself, its hem embroidered with tiny stitches that caught the light like stars. Her mother's indigo shawl draped her shoulders, a symbol of continuity, of love carried through loss. In her hands, she held a single marigold from their garden, its golden petals bright against the soft fabric. Inside, the pews were half filled, The townsfolk's curiosity tempered by a growing respect for the woman who'd stitched her way into their lives. Samuel waited at the altar, his Sunday suit pressed, his gray eyes steady as they met hers. Ben stood beside him, clutching a ring, tied with a ribbon, while Lila and Ruth fidgeted in new dresses, their smiles brighter than the sunlight streaming through the windows. The air smelled of polished wood and summer blooms, and the quiet hum of anticipation wrapped around Eleanor like a warm embrace. The ceremony was brief, the preacher's words simple, but every vow carried the weight of their shared journey. "I take you, Eleanor," Samuel said, his voice low and sure, "to walk this life together, through every season." Her response was softer, but no less resolute. "And I take you, Samuel, to build and mend, always." Their hands joined, his calluses against her needle-pricked fingers, sealing a bond forged in silence and strengthened by choice. Afterward, the congregation spilled into the churchyard, where a modest feast awaited, Eleanor's tarts and bread, alongside Samuel's roasted vegetables, a table of their combined labor. The children ran through the grass, laughter rising like birdsong, while the townsfolk offered tentative smiles, their whispers now laced with acceptance. Eleanor and Samuel stood together, not touching but close, their presence a quiet defiance of the past's shadows. As dusk fell, they walked to the ranch, their new home, the path lined with fireflies blinking like tiny lanterns. In the stillness, Samuel took her hand, his thumb tracing her knuckles. "You reminded me who I already was," he murmured, echoing a truth she'd carried in her heart since their first connection. Eleanor smiled, her gaze on the horizon where the last light lingered. "And you showed me I was enough." They stood in shared silence, the world soft around them, their union a testament to dignity and peace, a love built not on grand gestures, but on the quiet courage to begin again, together.